William Morris. Yeats's political education, begun in the school of John O'Leary, was advanced in the Hammersmith Lecture Hall, where the Socialist League met with William Morris presiding. The poet's early socialism, though dismissed by most critics, had a significant and lasting influence upon his later political attitudes. For example, the hatred of laissez-faire capitalism, inculcated by Morris, helps to explain Yeats's initial interest in the clever posturings of the fascist leaders, since to men disgusted by the hypocrisy and materialism of the bourgeois state, but afraid of the tyranny of the mass mind apparently threatened by the communists, fascism offered itself as a radical alternative. Yeats's interest in Morris, therefore, has wider implications than the brevity of their association suggests. The two men first met in April 1886, when Morris came to Dublin to preach us into socialism. His lecture was unsympathetically received, but Yeats, who spent the evening with him at the Contemporary Club, was impressed by Morris's social and economic explanation of the modern decline in artistic standards. When his family moved to London in 1887, Yeats went on Sunday evenings to the socialist lectures at Kelmscott House, and I was one of a little group of regular attendants who were always invited to supper. He enjoyed this privilege frequently between 1887 and 1890, writing on the first occasion, "Last Sunday evening I had supper at Morris's, pictures by Rossetti all round the room, and in the middle much socialistic conversation. Morris kindly asked me to write for the Commonweal, somewhat on the Irish question. However, though I think socialism good work, I am not sure that it is my work." Further contact with Morris, whom he greatly liked, almost changed his mind. "There were moments when I thought myself a socialist, and saw Morris more as a public man and social thinker." Yeats was particularly attracted by Morris's artistic perspective on socialism, and did not read economics, having turned socialist because of Morris's lectures and pamphlets. These lectures and pamphlets offer a synthesis of Marxism and the romantic social criticism of Carlyle and Ruskin, which appealed to Yeats far more than the doctrines of the mainstream labor movement, from which Morris himself was increasingly isolated. The Socialist League was to the left of the Unions and the Fabians, advocating revolution and shunning parliamentary politics. Morris called himself a communist, and many members of the League were anarchists. The Sunday lecture audience included self-educated working men, radical intellectuals, and eminent socialist sympathizers. Topics were often cultural, and the tone of the meetings was predominantly theoretical and speculative. As in Dublin, revolutionary politics rubbed shoulders with artistic discussion. Although the nationalists were cool towards socialism, the socialists were interested in Irish problems. Morris led the League in the 1885-7 agitation for Home Rule and in protests against the various coercion bills designed to crush Irish agrarian unrest. The League's sympathy for the Irish cause, greater than that of other socialist bodies, helped to convince Yeats that the school of Morris was not incompatible with the school of John O'Leary. Both Morris and O'Leary insisted upon the need for revolution, and Yeats was equally ready to envisage the destruction of society. "Certainly I, and all about me, were for chopping up the old king for Medea's pot." He, too, became violent with the violent solemnity of a religious devotee. In later years, he wondered if Maude Gonne's socialist sympathies were characteristic of Pound's generation that has survived the Romantic movement, and of mine and hers that saw it die. I, too, a revolutionist. Some drop of hysteria still at the bottom of the cup. His older self stigmatized as hysteria his earlier romantic commitment to rebellion, national and social. Revolutionaries like O'Leary and Morris naturally rejected parliamentary democracy as a method of changing the world. Morris had told us to have nothing to do with the parliamentary socialists, represented for men in general by the Fabian Society and Hyndman's Social Democratic Federation, and for us in particular by Shaw. During the period of transition, mistakes must be made, and the discredit of these mistakes must be left to the bourgeoisie. In News from Nowhere, Morris's utopian vision of the perfect society, the Houses of Parliament are used as a storage place for manure. O'Leary shared these anarchist tendencies, for while state socialism might threaten individual liberty, anarchism exalted it. Yeats, although he regarded anarchism and socialism as related rather than opposed, also leant towards anarchism. Prince Kropotkin's descriptions of the Russian anarchist movement led him to desire, in every branch of our national propaganda, young men who would have the sincerity and the precision of those Russian revolutionists that Kropotkin and Stepnyak tell us of. Morris, although he professed to dislike anarchist influence on the League, fostered it by his abstentionist policies. Shaw suggested to Yeats that Morris was an anarchist without knowing it, and certainly Morris thought state socialism neither possible nor desirable. Marx had envisaged the gradual withering away of the state apparatus, but in News from Nowhere, Morris's communist utopia emerges fully blown from the revolution. It has no centralized bureaucracy, no political parties, no judiciary, no police. In fact, no government. Yeats wholeheartedly endorsed this vision of freedom. If the men and women imagined by the poets were the norm, and if Morris had, in let us say News from Nowhere, then running through the commonweal, described such men and women, living under their natural conditions, or as they would desire to live, then those conditions themselves must be the norm, and could we but get rid of certain institutions, the world would turn from eccentricity. Yeats's picture of natural life, perverted by the artificial constraints of government, reveals his romantic bias. His belief in the freedom of the individual led to a suspicion of political institutions. He wrote disapprovingly that Spenser had learned to put the state, which desires all the abundance for itself, in the place of the church, and to look to the state not only as the rewarder of virtue, but as the maker of right and wrong, and had begun to love and hate as it bid him. The fascist state desired all abundance for itself, superseded private morality to erect its own, and directed the hatreds of its citizens. Throughout his life, Yeats consistently defended private freedoms against the encroachment of government. He was in no danger of becoming a state worshipper, or of assuming that the individual is less important than some mystic whole. Literature, he wrote, is the principal voice of the conscience, and it is its duty age after age to affirm its morality against the special moralities of clergymen and churches, and of kings and parliaments and peoples. Both Morris and Yeats found a romantic political ally in William Blake. Adopting Blake's axiom, kings and parliament seem to me something other than human life, Yeats approved his desire to recover the Golden Age, the simple world in which Christ taught and lived, whose lawlessness is the lawlessness of him who, being all virtue, acted from impulse and not from rules, and his 70 disciples sent against religion and government. The citizens of News from Nowhere inhabit such a world, for under ideal social conditions no rules need trammel romantic self-expression. Blake's rebellion against social and political tyranny caused him to redefine his values, for what society called virtue was hypocritical conformity. Lawlessness was virtue where the law was unjust. According to Yeats, Blake was convinced that the things his opponents held white were indeed black, and the things they held black were white, that all busy with government are men of darkness and something other than human life. One is reminded of Shelley, who was the next to take up the cry, though with a less abundant philosophic faculty, but still more of Nietzsche, whose thought flows always, though with an even more violent current. In the bed Blake's thought has worn. Yeats saw Blake, Nietzsche, and Shelley, therefore, as defenders of freedom and rebels against government. Shelley's desire for revolution, however, was, in Yeats's view, meta-political. His liberty was so much more than the liberty of political justice that it was one with intellectual beauty, and the regeneration he foresaw was so much more than the regeneration many political dreamers have foreseen that it could not come in its perfection till the hours before time to his tomb in eternity. In A Defense of Poetry, he will have it that the poet and the lawgiver hold their station by the right of some faculty, the one uttering in words and the other in the forms of society his vision of the divine order, the intellectual beauty. But to transcend political revolution is not to ignore it. Shelley's doctrine reinforced Yeats's belief in the social and political role of the poet, whose perception of beauty inspires rebellion against tyranny. The power which, in Leon and Sithna, awakens the mind of the reformer to contend, and itself contends, against the tyrannies of the world, Yeats wrote, is first seen as the star of love or beauty. Shelley calls the spirit of beauty liberty, because despotism, and perhaps as the man of virtuous soul commands not, nor obeys all authority, pluck virtue from her path towards beauty, and because it leads us by that love whose service is perfect freedom. The idea that all authority destroys that love whose service is perfect freedom inspired Yeats's play Where There Is Nothing, described by an earlier reviewer as subversive and revolutionary. The hero, Paul Rutledge, is a romantic anarchist who advocates the destruction of the laws, the towns, the church, and finally the world. For where there is nothing, there is God. Like Blake, Paul praises Jesus Christ, who made a terrible joy and sent it to overturn governments and all settled order. The play embodies Shelley's belief that liberty is love. Love for both Shelley and Yeats is inseparable from the perception of beauty, and it is an apocalyptic force which can overturn the tyrannies of the world. In The Tables of the Law, Owen Ahern believes that the beautiful arts were sent into the world to overthrow nations, and finally life herself, by sowing everywhere unlimited desires like torches thrown into a burning city. This idea was not at the time, I believe, more than a paradox, a plume of the pride of youth, and it was only after his return to Ireland that he endured the fermentation of belief which is coming upon our people with the reawakening of their imaginative life. The abstract idea is rooted in the Irish political context. Similarly, Shelley's belief in the power of the poet was amplified by Yeats's admiration for the ancient Irish bards, who were indeed legislators and prophets. They were the most powerful influence in the land, and all manner of superstitious reverence environed them round. Their rule was one of fear as much as love. A poem and an incantation were almost the same. In The King's Threshold, the bard defies the king and defends the apparently subjective vision of poetry as the pattern or blueprint of the perfect life. I said the poets hung images of the life that was in Eden above the childbed of the world, that it, looking upon those images, might bear triumphant children. Images of the life that was in Eden are not merely nostalgic evocations of a lost paradise, they are stimuli to present revolution. Yeats thus justified Morris's vision of an earthly paradise. He knew, as Shelley knew, by an act of faith, that the economists should take their measurements not from life as it is, but from the vision of men like him, from the vision of the world made perfect, that is buried under all minds. Blake thought that art was an attempt to recreate the Golden Age. Yeats undertook this labour in Ireland under the aegis of Morris and the great liberal romantics. Morris also introduced Yeats to some not-so-liberal Victorians, saying that his political ancestors were Ruskin and Carlyle, but somebody should have been beside Carlyle and punched his head every 5 minutes. Accordingly, Yeats praised Ruskin, but took every opportunity of aiming the punches at Carlyle, whom he blamed for the gloomy hatred spread in Ireland by John Mitchel. Mitchel's native harshness had been magnified by his admiration for the theatrical and ill-bred Carlyle. Carlyle's violent rhetoric, Yeats feared, might inspire real violence. Of Standish O'Grady, Carlyle's disciple, a Tory unionist and a believer in aristocracy, Yeats wrote, O'Grady's political vagaries have all sprung, it seems to me, from that love of force common among a certain type of literary men, the impatience of minds trained to see further than they can go, to discover far-off ideals before the road that leads to them, are responsible for much of it, and Carlyle for the rest, perhaps. This acute criticism of literary power worship indicates that if Carlyle indeed had fascist disciples, Yeats was not among them. Morris rejected Carlyle's political conclusions and his doctrine of commanding spirits, but inherited his loathing of 19th century materialism and his conviction that the inhumanity of modern social relationships had resulted in artistic decline. Morris, Carlyle, and Ruskin were united in refusing to disassociate art from morality, politics, and religion. After reading Unto This Last, Yeats felt the same. Everything had become to me a form of ethics, and as I walked the streets I used to believe that I could define exactly the bad passion or moral vacancy that had created, after centuries, every detail of architectural ugliness. Morris's historical philosophy drew its artistic emphasis from Ruskin, but was basically Marxist. The feudal system had checked the evils of authoritarianism by socially prescribed personal rights and duties. Despite his medievalism, Morris did not desire a return to the system, but Carlyle frequently, and Ruskin occasionally, gave signs of wishing to do so. Yeats also valued the idea of personal rights and duties, but never pretended that feudalism meant freedom. Whereas Ruskin saw Gothic gargoyles as signs of the life and liberty of every workman who struck the stone, Yeats was not so politically naive. I do not see in Gothic architecture, as did the 19th century historians, the creation of a new communal freedom, but a creation of authority, a suppression of that freedom, though with its consent. With the rise of the bourgeoisie at the end of the Middle Ages, wrote Morris, the reign of commercial contract and cash payment began to take the place of the old feudal hierarchy with its many linked chains of personal responsibilities. Yeats put it more symbolically. The capture of a Spanish treasure ship in the time of Elizabeth made England a capitalist nation. Capitalism, as Marx had pointed out, created the modern representative state, a development which Yeats condemned in his 1902 essay, Edmund Spenser. While composing the essay, it flashed upon me that the coming of allegory coincided with the rise of the middle class, that it was the first effect on literature of the earnest spirit, which afterwards created Puritanism. Anticipating the more celebrated speculations of Weber and Tawney, Yeats linked capitalism and the Protestant ethic. He saw the Middle Ages destroyed by the triumph of the Puritan and the merchant, because religion had denied the sacredness of an earth that commerce was about to corrupt and ravish. Bourgeois individualism also broke up the organic community, and Yeats did not need original thought to discover, being so late of the school of Morris, that the distinction of classes had become their isolation. The isolation of classes, combined with capitalist methods of production, had, according to Morris, destroyed popular art. No longer the workman's expression of joy in his labor, art had become a sham carried on by dilettante fine gentlemen and ladies, without any help from below. Yeats, who also disliked cultural elitism, approved Morris's efforts to reintegrate the aesthetic and the practical. In England, men like William Morris, seeing about them passions so long separated from the perfect that it seemed as if they could not be changed until society had been changed, tried to unite the arts once more to life by uniting them to use. They advised painters to paint fewer pictures upon canvas and to burn more of them on plates, and they tried to persuade sculptors that a candlestick might be as beautiful as a statue. Yeats agreed that poetic tradition should be manifest not in pictures and in poems only, but in tiles round the chimney-place, and in the hangings that kept out the draught. The sequestration of poetry between the covers of books had meant its appropriation by the literate few, but in News from Nowhere the poetic impulse finds embodiment in functional objects, in dress, in architecture, at work, and in communal singing and dancing. This ideal haunted Yeats. The precondition for its achievement, however, was not the autocratic imposition of better artistic standards, but a movement towards economic equality. We can never hope to build up a state where multitudes will starve in slums, that a few men may have great wealth. We should seek to distribute among all enough of leisure and enough of independence to give all their chance of thinking nobly and feeling nobly. Economic egalitarianism was difficult to reconcile with that bulwark of the 19th century capitalist system, the liberal policy of laissez-faire. Here Yeats disagreed with his father. disciple of Mill. When I began to argue for a law-made balance among trades and occupations, my father displayed at once the violent free trader and propagandist of liberty. Yeats enlisted the support of Unto This Last, and one night a quarrel over Ruskin came to such a head that in putting me out of the room he broke the glass in a picture with the back of my head. Yeats's dislike of British liberalism, which he saw as a combination of the mechanistic utilitarian ethic and the economics of Ricardo, had originally a humanitarian basis. His love of liberty was modified on this one point. Although he feared the increase of the state's power to dictate to the individual, he approved of state action to better the lot of the wretched. The liberty to succeed in open commercial competition was not so priceless as to be worth the misery of the exploited. The teachings of Morris, then, had a profound effect upon the quality of Yeats's nationalism. He had hated imperialism because it destroyed Irish freedom. Now he hated it because it was inherently evil. It was an oppression of the poor and weak by the strong and wealthy, the last stage of the capitalist system. Combining Marx and Jesus, Yeats boasted, "No Irish voice has been lifted up in praise of that imperialism which is but a more painted and flaunting materialism, because Ireland has taken sides forever with the poor in spirit, who shall inherit the earth." Davis and Mitchel had prepared him to accept Morris's loathing of modern British civilization. Now he felt that Ireland, as yet uncorrupted by industrialism, might become the defender of ancient values. New from the influence, mainly the personal influence, of William Morris, I dreamed of enlarging Irish hate, till we had come to hate with a passion of patriotism what Morris and Ruskin hated. Mitchel had already poured some of that hate drawn from Carlyle, who had it of an earlier and, as I think, cruder sort, into the blood of Ireland. And were we not a poor nation with ancient courage, unblackened fields, and a barbarous gift of self-sacrifice? Significantly, however, Yeats refused to adopt popular racialist rhetoric in his attacks on England. Arnold had attributed the special qualities of Celtic literature to racial characteristics, but Yeats argued that the Irish were simply less tainted by the modern world. I myself throw the blame for that decline of the spiritual and intellectual energies of which Mr. Martin and Mr. Moore are convinced, as were Ruskin and Morris, and Arnold and Carlyle, upon that commercialism and materialism on which these men warred, and not upon race, as do certain of my countrymen. Irish conditions of life, especially the agricultural basis of her economy and her relative poverty, meant that the pastoral idyll of News from Nowhere was actually within reach. In a speech delivered in New York, Yeats translated Morris's egalitarian vision into Irish terms. "We Irish do not desire, like the English, to build up a nation where there shall be a very rich class and a very poor class. Ireland will always be in the main an agricultural country. Industries we may have, but we will not have, as England has, a very rich class, nor whole districts blackened with smoke, like what they call in England their black country. I think that the best ideal for our people, an ideal very generally accepted among us, is that Ireland is going to become a country where, if there are few rich, there shall be nobody very poor. Wherever men have tried to imagine a perfect life, they have imagined a place where men plough and sow and reap, not a place where there are great wheels turning and great chimneys vomiting smoke. Ireland will always be a place where men plough and sow and reap." He spoke with confidence because in America the words of Morris and Ruskin have found hearers who have listened better because of Thoreau and Emerson, and everywhere one finds one's own table of values. In Ireland, Yeats sought to implement this table of values by supporting Sir Horace Plunkett's Irish Agricultural Organisation Society, a body which advocated cooperative farming, and which he later suggested had been the model for Soviet collectives. At the 1897 conference of the IAOS, he made a successful speech which warmly supported the aims and methods of the cooperators, and asserted that idealists like himself valued and needed the work of practical men. He even welcomed the revival of Irish industry, praising cloth and paper mills as well as improved agricultural organization. Yeats was no lover of picturesque poverty. Indeed, he pleaded once again for a nation in which no one would be poor, and advocated the distribution of prosperity among all. The cooperative magazine, The Irish Homestead, recognized that there is no clash of ideals between the workaday theories which Mr. Plunkett and his friends have for many years been inculcating, and the dreamy pensiveness which would characterize the return of Mr. Yeats's golden age, when the country would be a land where it was always afternoon. Not all was dreamy pensiveness, however. Yeats persuaded his friend, the poet and mystic George Russell, A.E., to become one of Plunkett's organizers. When A.E. became disheartened with the work, Yeats encouraged him in terms which would have astonished the mild Plunkett. Remember always that now you are face to face with Ireland, its tragedy and its poverty, and if we would express Ireland, we must know her to her heart and in all her moods. Absorb Ireland and her tragedy, and you will be the poet of a people, perhaps the poet of a new insurrection. Sunday lecture meetings at Hammersmith ceased in November 1890, but before that date, Yeats stopped attending. As the months passed, I became less of a socialist, he wrote. His quarrel was not with Morris, but with the atheistic premises of Marxism, and with one young working man whose ideas about religion were pure Karl Marx. I disliked the working men revolutionists, their perpetual overstatement, and above all their attacks on religion, and at last I ceased to attend the debates and lectures after a speech as exaggerated as any of their own on the slowness of change and the dependence of all ideas of equality of wealth on Christianity. The Marxists might attack the materialism of the bourgeoisie, but their philosophy was equally materialistic. Yeats, whose socialism was not scientific, loathed materialism. Despite his break with the League, however, he only gradually gave up thinking of and planning for some near sudden change for the better. The influence of Morris, who had never angered Yeats by any comment on religion, persisted long afterwards. It was revealed primarily in Yeats's Irish utopianism, and in specific instances, such as his support for the workers in the Dublin lockout of 1913, his desire for art galleries and educational facilities for the poor, his attitude to social legislation in the Irish Senate, his conviction that the state should supply the basic necessities and decencies of life for its citizens, and his often repeated approval of the idea of limiting incomes. Many years later, Yeats wrote that, although he did not value Morris's poetry very highly, I would choose to live his life, poetry and all, rather than my own or any other man's. Morris had achieved, in an untroubled way, a synthesis of individual purpose and social concern that Yeats could only envy.